On April 25th, 2010, Heidi Firkus was murdered in her home in what her husband claimed was a home invasion. It would take investigators over a decade to piece together what really happened. Here's the story. Nicholas Firkus was born February 25th, 1983. His wife Heidi was born December 14th, 1984. Nick lived with his wife Heidi at 1794 West Minnehaha Avenue in St. Paul. Nick and Heidi Firkus met sometime in the early 2000s at church when they were still in their teens. They married in 2005 when Nick was 22 and Heidi was 20. They purchased the 1794 West Minnehaha Avenue house in 2007. Everything seemed to be going fine, but one Sunday morning in April of 2010, their lives would be irreparably damaged. On April 25, 2010, St. Paul Police Dispatch received two 911 calls 65 seconds apart. The first call was from Heidi Firkus, saying that an intruder was trying to break into the house. 38 seconds into the call, a noise similar to a gunshot could be heard, and the line went dead. 65 seconds later, the same number called back. This time it was Nick, saying that both he and his wife had been shot. Nick had indeed been shot as well in the thigh, which was described more as a graze wound. Nick's story was that he went to bed after he and Heidi watched the movie Avatar at around 11 p.m. He said that about 6 a.m. he got up to get a glass of water from the bathroom and then went back to bed for a few minutes. He said he then heard the front door jiggling but didn't think much of it until he heard some more jiggling sounds and woke up Heidi, telling them that they needed to leave. After he heard the noises at the front door, Nick claims that he grabbed his double-barrel shotgun, loaded it, and then sent Heidi down first. In what universe does that make sense? What husband does that? Nick claimed that he had a plan in place with Heidi in case of an intruder where they would just try to exit the house without a confrontation. However, investigators weren't sure why it would make sense to leave the relative safety of your bedroom and head towards the problem with no law enforcement or military training. The police asked Nick about his marriage and he kind of said, yeah, it was all okay except, the normal stuff. And then they got to financial questions and he admitted that they were behind on bills and that they were supposed to be evicted the very next day after Heidi's murder. During his initial questioning with the St. Paul police, Nick waited an hour and a half to ask about Heidi's status. Approximately 90 minutes into the interview, Nick says, I just want to know the final answer on Heidi. And the detective says, she didn't make it. To which Nick responds, I figured that, in a rather dry, calm tone. Nick's lawyer advised him not to answer any more police questions shortly after the murder. Nick and his attorney actually worked with a private sketch artist to produce a sketch that only produced one lead. It was later found that that person was incarcerated at the time of Heidi's death, so he was swiftly ruled out. In the spring of 2011, Nick began dating Rachel Sanchez, who was a sister of one of Heidi's close friends. Rachel Firkus, Nick's second wife, said that she would sometimes ask him things along the lines of, are you going to put any effort into finding who did this? But that as far as she was aware, he never reached out to investigators. Sergeant Nicole Sipes confirms this, saying that of 4 investigators into Heidi's death, Nick never reached out to any of them once. Nick's dishonesty during his marriage to Rachel eventually made her question his account of Heidi's death and whether or not he could have been involved, especially after she found a letter stating that they had not paid their property taxes and that they were facing eviction if they didn't pay. This is a transcript of the recording Rachel Firkus made of her confrontation with Nick. And it goes like this. Rachel, your actions have caused me to just distrust you completely. And the fact that your lying was so easy for you to do in front of me over and over and over makes me think, Nick, that I could murder my wife. Rachel, that you could lie about something. Nick, that I could murder my wife. Rachel, yes. And then Nick kind of goes like, ugh. And that's the end of the recording, and I believe after that they argued. Nick and Rachel divorced in 2018, and in 2020, Sergeant Nicole Sipes of the St. Paul Police Department, who was by then the lead investigator on the case starting in 2019, contacted Rachel and asked if she had any additional information she would like to give. And oh boy did she. After taking over the case in 2019, Sergeant Nicole Sipes of the St. Paul Police Department looked very deep into Nick and Heidi's finances, assisted by the FBI, and found that their mortgage hadn't been paid in 22 months at the time of Heidi's murder. Sipes also believes that Heidi was completely unaware of the magnitude of the couple's financial situation. She spoke to foreclosure and eviction attorneys who had no memory of ever meeting Heidi and found no paperwork that she had signed. She also was not present at the eviction hearing on March 8, 2010. Sergeant Sipes believes that Nick murdered Heidi because he couldn't bear to face up to her the truth that he had financially ruined them. She said that he also had this reputation among their friend group as this wise man that had his stuff together and could answer deeper questions about life, and that she thought he wouldn't want to give up that reputation by admitting that he had lost their house by not paying their mortgage. When reviewing the couple's texts and emails, Nikki Sipes also found no record of any conversation that would indicate Heidi was aware of the incoming foreclosure. In a series of emails in March and April of 2010, Heidi said she was receiving phone calls from creditors and asked Nick repeatedly if he could handle it and respond to it. Nick reassured her by saying basically, oh, it's all good. I'm in contact with the bank and it's just an audit they're doing because we had some fraud on our account. But our credit scores are good and don't worry, I'll handle it. And there was no evidence that their bank had ever conducted such an audit. On March 10th of 2010, just 2 days after Nick attended the eviction hearing by himself without Heidi, Nick and Heidi together went and toured 2 separate apartments that had a rent of $1,400 and $2,200 a month respectively, which is basically just even more evidence that Heidi didn't know. Detectives also executed a search warrant shortly after Heidi's murder and found everything in its place and didn't find anything to indicate that they were going to move soon, like any boxes or tape or anything like that. Sipes says that both Nick and Heidi's friends and family were unaware of the fact that they had to move. Nicholas Firkus was arrested on May 19th, 2021 by a St. Paul SWAT team and was charged with second-degree murder in Heidi's death. A grand jury later returned an indictment of both first and second-degree murder in Heidi's death. Nick's trial began in January of 2023. The judge ruled that neither Rachel Firkus's testimony nor her recorded conversation with Nick could be used as evidence. During the trial, prosecutors Rachel Crocker and Elizabeth Lawman reenacted the 65-second time frame between the 2 911 calls. They found that he would have had enough time to shoot Heidi, check to make sure that she was indeed dead, and then dial 911 after shooting himself. The defense claims the prosecution did not account for 2 misdials that Nick made during this 65-second time frame, which would make that window much harder to accomplish all that in. Basically, they say that he didn't have enough time due to those 2 misdials. No DNA or fingerprints from a third person were ever found. The defense claims that the lack of fingerprints can be explained by the suspect's use of gloves. Additionally, no signs of forced entry were found. However, there were tool marks in the door. The defense claims that these tool marks were made by the suspect, but what they really came from, who can say? Nick's next-door neighbor at the time, Brandon O'Connor, testified that he heard a voice saying something to the effect of, "You shot her, you shot me, please no," which Nick's lawyers point to as evidence that he was innocent and that he was talking to a third person. Prosecutor Lawman says Nick was screaming into the phone for 7 minutes during the 911 call, making the claim that Brandon merely misheard Nick that much more believable. 2 days after Heidi's death, during the execution of a search warrant, police did a test of Nick's story where they sent one officer up into the upstairs bedroom while another jiggled the front door handle like the intruder had supposedly done. This test was filmed, and the officer upstairs heard nothing. The FBI even created a 2-scale model of the Firkus home to disprove Nick's story. Investigators were struck by particularly the small size of the front foyer, and they really doubted that 2 grown men could have a life or death struggle over a shotgun in that small of a space. In this front area, near the front door by the foyer, was a small table with several small items on it that was completely undisturbed. How that would happen when 2 grown men just had a violent altercation over a shotgun, I don't know. The FBI also enhanced the audio of the 911 call to see if they could find evidence of a third person, and they found absolutely none. Ballistics tests also showed that the shotgun blast that hit Heidi was probably fired from shoulder level, therefore being inconsistent with accidental discharge. The prosecution pointed out shotgun pellets in the bottom of the door that they believe was from Nick shooting himself in the leg after bracing himself against the door. On February 10th, 2023, closing arguments for both the state and the defense were presented. That day, the jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours before convicting Nicholas Firkus of both first and second degree murder in the death of his wife, Heidi Firkus. On April 13th, 2023, Nicholas Firkus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving that sentence in MCF Rush City. All right, folks, this is it. 1794 West Minnehaha Avenue in St. Paul. This is the house where Nicholas Firkus was convicted of murdering his wife in 2010. Thanks so much for watching. My sources are in the description. I'll definitely bring you more. For Twin Cities True Crime Tours, I'm Taylor Nielsen.